I'm trusting the autofocus. I'm wearing red on a pink background. Let's do this. Hey, Sean. I wanted to talk about lighting for a second. If you're anything like me, you went through this whole phase that so many creators and producers did over the past really 2 years of buying all this gear that came out. Sliders and lights and little lights and microphones and stabilizers and all this stuff that helps you make better stuff. And then a lot of us are realizing most of it we don't actually use, or it's so specialized that it just gets used so rarely that it probably is better to rent than to invest in. So I wanted to talk specifically about lights right now. And I want to talk about lights for non-cinematic purposes. So I need to quickly say, cinematic purposes are if you're lighting a movie, if you need to create a mood, if you're trying to have it, you're trying to create what looks like sunlight coming through a shade, but you're on a soundstage, you need a particular kind of light. You need single source lights that you can do these things with. I'm not talking about that. I'm focusing on what you need for interviews, for talking head YouTube stuff, if you're doing video conferencing, even if you're doing product reviews and things like that. The lights that you need to light most common things when you're not trying to be dramatic and really push a narrative with your lighting, when you just need good, professional, polished lighting, that's what I'm focusing on. So the two different kinds of lights that I have a lot of experience with over the past couple of years have been my Aputure single source lights and more recently, my Quasar LED tubes. And the big difference between these two things is that the Aputures are single source light, meaning that all of the light that they create comes from a single spot, which means you can do a lot with it, you have a lot of control, but sometimes you have to do a lot to it to have it be usable on whatever you're trying to do. Quasar tubes are like LED panels and other LED tubes where the light comes from a much wider source, and so it's a softer light, which means that you can't control it quite as well as you can a single source light, but sometimes it saves you some steps in what you need to do and how much room you need to shape the light into what you want it to be when it hits your subject. So I'm going to compare over a few different categories, the Aputure 300D Mark II and the other Aputure lights versus the Quasar daylight tubes and in general other LED panels and things like that. So first up is size, and it's kind of a tie in a different way. On set, the Aputure is big. You need room. It's a huge light. You need room to spread it out before it's diffused enough where it can be, soft and beautiful on somebody's skin especially. It takes a lot of room to set up. So its footprint is big on set compared to an Aputure tube, which can be a lot closer, which can be closer to its diffuser because the light is already spread out on it. But for traveling and packing purposes, having a 2-foot LED tube or a 4-foot LED tube like the one above me, that's a big thing to carry around, is where the Aputure packs up nice and neat into a little case, and it's a durable case that you can, throw in the back of your truck and be on your way, as where the Aputure tubes are out and exposed unless you're getting a big case, which is a big case just to carry your lights. So it's kind of a wash. The Aputures are easier to get to a place, but I think the actual setup is a little cleaner and a little leaner when you're using panels or tubes. Next up is brightness, and the Aputure 300D cannot be touched for its brightness. It is a very, very powerful light, and in my tests that we're going to see in a minute, it was set on 10% of its power, and when I'm shooting indoors, I never put it above 40%. It's so bright that it's meant for being able to, light a cinematic scene. It's you can balance. If you're in the sun, you can put the Aputure on the other side and balance out for the exposure of the sun. It's very, very bright compared to the Quasar tubes. However, if I'm not using all of that power, like in most indoor situations when I'm bringing all my own lights, when I'm coming into somebody's office or into their studio and building something, I don't need all that wattage. And so to spend $1,100 on a single source, super, super, super bright light versus spending $45 on a Quasar tube, that's going to be a better use of money for me. So not only are they cheaper, but you can get to the look you need to get to for a lot less, even if you have to buy a lot of those Quasar lights. Now, granted, if you bought enough 15-watt Quasar tubes to equal the 300 watts of the Aputure, you'd end up spending about $900 on Quasars versus the $1,100 on Aputures. So, and you would have so many of these lights that it would be a ridiculous and overly cumbersome setup and way too big and soft of a source. However, in that regard, it comes down pretty close when you go watt for dollar. Now, durability is a bit of a wash, again, for sort of two different reasons and two ends of the spectrum. The Aputure light is a metal, beefy, heavy light, and it comes in a case that's so sturdy you can stand on it. You can use it as a seat on set. They've been very robust in that regard. But the actual light filament, you can't touch it. If you get your oils from your finger onto the light, then it can end up cracking from the heat, and you can end up with problems. The actual filament of it, because all of it's condensed into this one little spot, it gets hot. That can be a problem for durability. And then once it's set up, it's kind of heavy, and if it falls from something, it is absolutely going to break. However, the Quasars are plastic, and on the surface you might think like, oh, plastic's not that great, metal's going to be more durable, but the plastic is hard plastic, and it fails if you clamp it too tight. You can end up cracking it if you're, putting it someplace. But because it's plastic, you can grab it, you can touch it, you can wave it around, you can tape it to something. You can tape right over part of it that has light on it. If you want to, only use part of the tube, you can wrap part of it in black wrap, and it's not going to be a problem. I've found that the Quasar tubes are a little bit more delicate when I transport them, because I'm putting this big long piece of plastic somewhere, or it doesn't fit in a case too well. But on set, they're really convenient, and they've been tough enough to handle anything that I've thrown at them. Convenience is the next piece, and convenience really comes down to a personal preference. For me, the Aputure lights and the single source lights, if I'm going to use them for an interview, they need modifiers. And the modifiers that they need are big, because it's such a bright single source light that there has to be space between the light and the diffusion, otherwise it's not going to end up being that diffused. And so they have very convenient things like the Aputure light dome, which I use, and it creates a beautiful light, but this thing is huge compared to the Quasars. Are already a soft source, so you can put them closer to a diffusion panel, take up less room, and this is something that I appreciate shooting in a home studio. I don't have a lot of room behind the camera to be setting up big lights and stands and stuff. To be able to put my diffusion closer to my light and have, something that's only 1.5 feet deep versus the Aputure and the Aputure light dome, which is huge, that goes a long way in my home studio. And sometimes, depending on the location I'm forced to shoot in for my on-location interviews, it can be a deal breaker there of whether or not I can actually get this light in there, out of frame, and far enough back to be useful. But with the Quasars, you can get virtually the same quality light with a little less space. And so this is a good time to talk about the quality of the light and what it actually looks like when it hits the face. And do you need the Aputure and the light dome to get that perfect soft light, or can it be done in other ways? So here are my head-to-head comparisons, and I'll let you judge what you think is best. What you need to know is I shot these at night so that there was no light leak from windows or anything here in my home studio. And I put the diffusion panel in the exact same spot as the front of the light dome was, so I could compare them and get a very, very similar cast on my face from the two different lights. So take a look. This is being lit by the Aputure 300D Mark II. There are no other lights on in this room, no hair light, no computer screen, no practicals, no anything. There's a light dome on the front of the Aputure, and the front of the light dome is about 4 feet away from my face, making the light about 6.5 feet away from my face. And this is what it looks like. The light is set on only 10% of its power, but in this dark room with it 6 feet away from my face, that's all it needs. This is being lit by a bank of 4 daylight Quasar tubes, 2-foot long tubes, 4 of them, and about 1 foot in front of these is a diffusion panel, and that diffusion panel is about 4 feet away from my face, which is the exact distance that the light dome was from my face. And this is what it looks like. I think this looks a little bit brighter on the off side of my face, on the fill side of my face, because with the light dome, the entire light is captured in this black cloth and it only comes out the front. And right now with this setup, I just have the 4 tubes on in the room. So before they hit the diffusion that's between me, my face, and the light is also escaping, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling and creating more light around me that the Aputure did not spill. Now this setup is still the Quasar tubes, but I've taken a black blanket and I've draped it over the light fixture onto the diffuser, so that way there's not light spilling as much all over the room. It's still bouncing off the floor a little bit here and there more than the Aputure was, but this is just with the Quasar tubes, a diffusion panel, and a black blanket. This is what it looks like. The first thing I noticed when I looked at this footage was that the Aputure looks really orange. Now, on paper with the specifications, this Aputure and these Quasar tubes are supposed to be 5600 Kelvin. And looking at them, the Quasar tubes produced a good neutral gray on my shirt. I kept the camera settings the same between the two. The Aputure just seemed really orange and started to make things look a little funny. So here is another look at it, but I've corrected the Aputure so that it's a little cooler and it matches the Quasars a little more. But I wanted you to look now, without focusing on the color, to the softness of the light coming out of the Aputure and the light dome versus the Quasar and the diffusion panel. This is being lit by the Aputure 300D Mark II. Now this setup is still the Quasar tubes, 300D Mark II, Quasar tubes, 300D Mark II, Quasar tubes, 300D Mark II, Quasar tubes. So when we come to cost, looking at these two light setups which produce essentially the same result, one of them cost $1,100 for the light plus another $120 for the modifier. The other one cost $180 for all 4 tubes, $30 for a diffusion panel, and $12 for a board that I nailed them to, and I guess I put a load blanket over it to stop the light spill. But for me, that's a lot of money that I can invest in other lights and more flexible setups. And yes, I lose that flexibility to create really dramatic lighting, but for most of what I do, that's never going to be an issue. So for me, cost and light quality ends up being a wash for the purposes that I'm using it for. Again, if you're doing cinematic stuff, I'm not talking about that. But for interviews and talking head stuff and product stuff, the light quality that hits my subject is essentially the same between these two sources. So why spend $1,300 on a light and modifiers versus spending $300 on a light and modifiers when in my circumstances, in my situations, it's going to be essentially the same thing. So ultimately, it becomes a personal decision and an analysis of what kind of things do you shoot. If you're trying to shoot creative stuff and cinematic things, and if you're going to be making short films, having a single source light is a good investment for you. If, however, you're on the more corporate and communication side of things, if you're doing YouTube studio things, stuff like that, you can save a lot of money because you don't need all of the wattage and you don't need all of the flexibility that a single source light provides, because every time you use it, you're going to just have to soften it anyway. So starting with a cheaper, softer light, which is still as high of quality, if not higher quality, you're going to be in a better spot and you're going to have more money to spend on sliders and gimbals and whatever else you want to do to up your YouTube game or your corporate communications game. So those are my thoughts. Think about what's right for you. Think about the usage case where you're going to use these if you're going to do independent films and things like that, or if you do a lot of mostly YouTube studio or corporate communications, interview, documentary work. Think about where you're going to use these lights and then prioritize which conveniences are better for you. Is it better to be leaner with what you can set up or faster? Is it better to have something that travels more robustly? If you're flying a lot, an Aputure is going to do you better than a Quasar tube probably will. So think about these things. Think about what you're going to shoot and where you're going to shoot it, and make the decision that's right for you. And if you're not ready, rent these things. There's a lot of different places that you can rent. I have an affiliate link and a coupon code for lensrentals.com if you want to try some of these lights or lights like them, or buy them from a place that has a generous return policy so that you can test these things out, see if it fits for you, see if it's the right gear, and if not, you're not stuck with a $1,000 paperweight that you wish you didn't own. That's all I got. Thanks for watching. See you later. Bye.